Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 Advisory Group, and we are a collaboration among 70 or so organizations in Massachusetts looking at ways to commemorate the beginnings of the American Revolution. And with us today, we have a terrific scholar on the American Revolution, Norm Desmarais from Rhode Island. Norm, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Bob.
And Norm is retired from Providence College, and in his retirement, he has become a real scholar of the Revolution, particularly the role of France in the Revolution. He's written 6 volumes of a guide to the American Revolution. He also edits the Brigade Dispatch. He's translated the Gazette Francois, a newspaper that was published by the French troops who arrived in Rhode Island, and he wrote The Road to Yorktown on the French campaigns in the Revolution. Also, he wrote about Louis Duportel. I'm probably mispronouncing his name. Washington's Engineer is the name of the book. Duportel, thank you. First of many corrections you'll have to make today. And then we're here actually mainly going to be talking about your book, America's First Ally, on France in the Revolutionary War. So, Norm, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Bob. I'm glad to be here.
So, why do you think it would have been possible for the Americans to win their independence without the French?
Definitely not. One of the things that I've learned quite recently is that 3/4 of the troops, 3/4 of the Allied forces at Yorktown were French. Rochambeau's army and Washington's army were pretty much equal in number. Throw in the Navy with Admiral de Grasse and Saint-Simon's troops, and that brings the total to 2/3 to 3/4 of the troops being French.
Now, what motivated the French? What did they have to gain by supporting the Americans in the Revolution?
Well, it was more getting revenge on England. The British had defeated the French in Canada and essentially took what we know as Canada today. They took the entire, almost half the continent, and the French had a very humiliating defeat at the Battle of Plains of Abraham in Quebec, and also at Montreal. And this was an opportunity for the French to try to humiliate the British, and to what they were interested in also were the fishing rights off Newfoundland. And as it turned out, in the peace treaty, they were pretty much totally ignored in terms of fishing rights and trade agreements. So in that sense, they did not gain anything in the Revolutionary War, and the war depleted their treasuries, so that it laid the foundations for the French Revolution.
So it didn't really work out for the French support.
No, it didn't. Not at all. They were supporting the Americans in hopes that the Americans would defeat the British and humiliate them, which actually happened. But it was all due to the French support.
Right.
Even the artillery that was used at Saratoga, much of it was French.
Right. And were there problems? I mean, the Americans and the French did not have a long, harmonious relationship. I mean, there were American troops up in Quebec when the French suffered their humiliating defeat. New Englanders had been fighting against New France for generations. So it was all smoothness and sweetness and light among these allies during the Revolution?
No, it was not. Not even among the French. The French were, in fact, while the French were in Newport, there were a number of duels that were fought between the French officers. But if you remember, back in the colonial period, from the early settlement to the Revolutionary War period, the French always sided with the Indians or the Native Americans, and they were the America's enemies.
Right.
And so consequently, when they became allies, they were very, very much suspected. And even when they arrived in Newport, Rochambeau was expecting a grand reception with sort of big parties and everything, and he was very much surprised that there was hardly anybody there to visit him. There were no brass bands, no military salutes or anything like that. everybody had locked themselves in their houses, and they were afraid. Well, the British had taught them that the French were ogres and monsters, and they eat babies, and they eat snails and salad, and stuff like that. So when the French actually landed, they were surprised to see well-fed troops and handsome men, and they were nothing like what they were expecting.
Wow. And it was one of the reasons for Benedict Arnolds gave for his betrayal, was that the French now were involved in this. So he wanted no. He said that's an ostensible reason, but you can see that this long period of distrusting these folks, and suddenly they're coming to save the day, and naturally the Rhode Islanders are going to lock themselves in their houses, knowing what they were expecting from the arrival of Rochambeau and his troops. So
yes, in fact, when the French first started coming here, even before Rochambeau arrived, back in '77, when the first French officers came to America and were being appointed as officers in the Continental Army, many of the American generals threatened to resign. Nathaniel Greene, John Sullivan, John Knox, all signed a letter that they sent to Congress threatening to resign if they had to serve under French officers. And Congress responded to General Sullivan saying that Congress is not accustomed to being dictated to by military officers, and if General Sullivan wants to resign, Congress will gladly accept his resignation. And that was the last time Sullivan used that ploy.
Wow. It might have been then after the first attempt at a Battle of Rhode Island, I think, doesn't Sullivan criticize the French for what happened in?
Yes, he did. There was a lot of acrimony between the French and the British, the French and the Americans after that battle. Part of that was due to that fact that they had been enemies in previous wars, and some of these generals had served in the French Indian War and recognized them as enemies. Another thing that was a major factor is that Admiral D'Estaing outranked Sullivan, and D'Estaing had he had a bitter taste that he had to serve under an inferior officer.
Yeah.
Not only was he an admiral in the Navy, but he was also a major general in the Army.
Okay.
And at the Battle of Saratoga, he commanded the army, the French army at Saratoga, but not at Saratoga, Savannah.
Savannah, yes. So I know you really are an authority on what happens in Rhode Island. Maybe we could talk a little bit about that first debacle in Newport when the army arrives and a hurricane blows up and other things happen. If we could, it's an interesting kind of episode as this beginnings of an alliance, and here the French are coming to save the day, and the British are entrenched in Newport, and Sullivan is trying to get them out, and then he has the French fleet coming to cooperate, and then things go very badly.
Yeah. Sullivan expected that the French would be on the west side of the island, on the side of where Newport is and in the harbor, so sort of facing that direction. And what happened is when the French arrived, D'Estaing disembarked his troops on Jamestown Island, which was Connecticut Island. It was called Connecticut Island back then. And they were getting their sea legs, their land legs back in shape. It was agreed that the French and the Americans would occupy Fort Butts on, I think it was August 10th. And in point of fact, what happened was that the British evacuated Fort Butts on August 8th or 9th, and Sullivan took command of the fort all by himself. Well, when D'Estaing learned about that, he was sort of pretty angry, and he had called all his troops back from Jamestown Island or Connecticut Island, boarded them back on the ship, and he sailed up the bay. But it was Sullivan had already captured the fort, and D'Estaing believed that Sullivan was capturing all the glories of war. And so that was the beginning of this discord. And not only did he resent Sullivan for being an inferior officer, and Sullivan resented D'Estaing for being an enemy who's now coming to aid him. But then what happened is that I think it was Admiral Howe's ships. He was bringing a fleet up the Atlantic, and he came off Newport, and so rather than getting trapped into Narragansett Bay, D'Estaing sailed out to meet him and engage him out at sea. But as they had no weather forecast, they didn't know that they were running into a storm, which essentially was a hurricane. And the hurricane lasted more than a day. And the two fleets got really badly damaged. There was more damage to the fleets from the hurricane than from the battle.
Wow.
And so both fleets had to disengage. I think there was only 2 ships that actually got engaged in battle, and they were pretty severely damaged. So the British decided to go back to New York to refit, and the French went up to Boston. And they were there for a while, I think a few months, to refit and to and then from there they went down to Savannah. Right. And there's some interesting stories. You and I had talked about Saint Sauveur, who's buried at King's Chapel.
Yes.
That was an event that occurred, the conflict that occurred during the time in Boston.
Right.
One of the officers he'd come over to America with the express intention of serving as an officer, but he didn't want a field command. But when he found out that there was an operation that was being put together for Rhode Island, he requested to go down to Rhode Island and serve there. And anyway, he got wounded in the operation at the Battle of Rhode Island. He was serving with the Continental Army, and after his wound, he requested to go back to Boston, and he went up there and he served in planning the defenses of of Boston to protect the French fleet and stuff. And that's where there were actions that occurred that sort of, there was a lot of conflict. The citizens resented the French, and there was a lot of conflict, and it broke out into squabbles. And there was, the French had brought the equipment to bake their own bread.
Right.
They had built ovens, and one of the problems was that the Continentals were short of bread, and the French had bread. And they wanted to buy the bread from the French. The French said they needed it for themselves, and they wouldn't sell it. So it ended up in a squabble and ended up in a fight in which Saint Sauveur was killed. Wow! And they needed a burial place. They buried him at King's Chapel, and there was a whole story about that afterward. But anyway, that's one of the things that went on while they were there. You want me to elaborate on another story about the French in Boston?
Sure. We're talking with Norm Desmarais, who is written about America's first ally, the France in the Revolutionary War. And so far, it doesn't sound like we're very good allies, but you're going to tell us another story about what happens in Boston.
The officers realized that they needed the French, but the lower officers and the soldiers still resented the French.
Right.
And one night there was, I forget the guy's name. He was a guy from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he decided to host D'Estaing and his officers. And they all went to his house, and he because the French were noted for loving frogs, he had scoured a number of ponds in the Boston area and had all of these large bullfrogs boiled in a soup. And during the dinner, he takes the ladle and ladles out a bowl of soup for the first officer, and it had a frog. And the officer looks at it. He holds it up by the legs, looking at this thing rather strangely. And why is it there? And they pass the bowl around the table. And by the time the bowl had finished going around the table, every officer had a bowl of soup with a frog in it, and they didn't know what to do with it. and the guy was insulted because the French weren't eating the frogs, and he thought that was their national delicacy.
And it was kind of an insult among the English, though, to refer to the French as frogs. It's a pejorative. Was that something the French were aware of? That maybe they thought he was insulted? I mean, they're being very polite taking the frogs, but it sounds like that could end in a big fight.
It was a prejudice that that they had, and once the French realized that this was a prejudice, that's why the guy had all good intentions.
Yeah.
And everybody started laughing about it afterward.
Wow. Now, in addition to this, I mean, we can see this big cultural problem. Was there a language barrier between the?
Yes, there was. There were several officers who had come from. They knew English. In fact, I just finished translating the diary of the Comte de Menonville, and he got his nobility from England, and that transferred into France. So when he came to America in 1777, he already spoke English and knew English quite well. So some of these officers served as translators, but many of them did not know French, and that became a barrier. Right. Particularly when the French came in to Newport in 1780. Rochambeau did not speak French, English. And the problems of trading and communicating with one another became a real problem. Some of them had translators, but the average soldiers certainly did not. Yeah. And Rochambeau maintained strict discipline while the troops were in Newport. Actually, whenever the troops were in camp in America, he had strict discipline that they stay in camp and they were not to associate with the local populace.
So we're talking with Norm Desmarais from Providence College about his work on the French in the American Revolution. Now, can you tell us a little bit about the Gazette Francois, the newspaper that they published, which you've translated? What kinds of things would they be writing about in?
The Gazette Francoise began publication in November of 1780. The French brought a printing press aboard one of their ships, probably the Neptune, and they set it up in Newport. Many people think it was at Hunter House, which was Admiral de Tonnay's headquarters, but today's Hunter House is twice the size of what it was in 1780. So if you look at the Hunter House, cut it in half, and then you realize that that is a pretty, though it's a large house, it's very small for a naval officer's headquarters. So not only would he have all of his staff there working during the day, there was no place for a printing press in my estimation. So I think the printing press was somewhere in that area, but not at Hunter House. It was at 341 Rue de la Pointe. I cannot find Rue de la Pointe on any map.
Wow.
And even
so that's obviously their name for it, not the local name for it.
Correct. But in many cases, they would use the local name as much as possible. And sometimes they would, if you look at the French maps, the names are all written in English. And sometimes they would write them phonetically. But as much as possible, they would use the English names as possible whenever possible. Now, what is now Washington Street, which is where Hunter House is, was used to be called Water Street in the 18th century. So between Water Street and Point Street, there's no connection in my estimation.
No. Interesting.
That area where de Tonnay's headquarters is called the Point, because the whole area came out in sort of as a crescent into the harbor. That's now all landfill. But back then it was a crescent around the harbor, and it's called the Point. because the
Okay.
lane came to a point.
Yeah.
And I think Point Street was probably one of the main streets going down to the point.
Yeah.
Today, that's called Bridge Street.
Hmm.
And it may have been Bridge Street, or it may have been one of the side streets.
Right.
But I think that's where
Okay.
Point Street was.
Okay.
Well, anyway, that's where the press was set up. And by November, the troops were getting pretty bored. They had been in Newport for a couple of months already. It's time to take winter quarters,
Hmm.
and they were facing the winter, so there was a lot of boredom. And I
Yeah.
think that was one of the problems with the Army at that time, is the
Mhm.
boredom of the winter.
Right.
So the newspaper was one of the devices that was going to give them something to do. They
Mhm.
printed the newspaper, the soldiers would have something to read, and they could discuss it.
Hmm.
And so what they would write in the newspaper were translations of articles that appeared in the American newspapers,
Okay.
so that they would be the French would know what's going on, and they would write about things that were of particular importance to the French, but there were stories that were drawn from American newspapers and translated.
Hmm.
The first issue of the paper was shortly after Arnold's betrayal of West Point.
Hmm.
So the first page of that issue is a scathing diatribe or rendition of the account,
Mhm.
and the French expression, the way the French describe it is really vituperative. The French have a way of insulting people and being very descriptive. They talk about Benedict Arnold as being a viper and a snake, and you ought to go back in the hole under the rock that he came from.
Wow. Well, so this is not simply translating things that they have seen, but they're actually adding editorializing.
There was some editorial to it also.
Yeah.
And there were 6 issues of that paper that still exist. And many people think that the paper was either discontinued because of lack of funds, or that they ran out of paper, or there might have been a number of other reasons. Because the last issue that we have, there's an ad in there at the end in both French and English, asking for rags to make paper.
Right.
But the press did not go out of business at that point, because they came out with an almanac in 1781. The first edition of Chatelain's Travels in America in French was printed on that press, and there was a report, an account of or a summary of the surrender at Saratoga, at Yorktown. It was printed on that press. Now, the press was somehow still in Newport, and the surrender was published in Newport, but the troops were in Yorktown and Williamsburg.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the connection is there.
Yeah.
There's a disconnect there.
Interesting.
When I was translating the diary of the Count de Lobedière, which was published as the Road to Yorktown, that diary had a lot of inserts. There was like a scrapbook, and they had a lot of inserts. Some of the inserts were newspaper issues, and 2 of them were the Gazette Francoise. So I thought that I had found the lost issue or a later issue of the Gazette Francoise that continued in Newport. But then I looked at the colophon and realized that this was published in Paris. You know, how did the press get back to Paris if the troops were still the Navy was still in America? Then I realized, I did some research on the newspapers and found that there's a Gazette de France that was published in Paris, and this was issue 93 of the Gazette de France, not the Gazette Francoise.
Oh, okay.
But when they put the title of the supplement that these were occurred in was the supplement to the Gazette, and it didn't specify Gazette de France or Gazette Francoise.
Right. Wow.
So the look of it appeared that they were from the Gazette Francoise, but they used pretty much the same typeface and the same fonts and devices.
Interesting. So they had a printing press, a newspaper set up. How many troops are we talking about who and sailors who would have been the audience for this or the market for this?
I figure about 6,800. Most
Oh,
people
okay.
think about 5,000 to 6,000.
Yeah.
I estimate about 6,800. The
Mm.
reason for the discrepancy is that the control, which are basically the muster rolls for the Royal Dupont Regiment, only list the officers.
Mm.
And I extrapolated that with these officers, they would command a certain so many men, about 12 to 1,300 men.
Mm-hmm.
So I figured that add another 12 to 1,300 men to the total figures that come up from the controls of the other regiments, and that sort of corresponds with the account in Menonville's diary, where he says the troops were upward of 6,000.
Okay. Yeah, we're talking with Norm Desmarais, author of America's First Ally on France in the Revolutionary War, as well as other works on the French role in the American Revolution. Now, early on in the war, Washington and the Americans really knew they needed engineers more than infantry, or they knew they needed naval support. So what can you tell us about the role of French engineers in the American War for Independence?
Okay. The Americans had engineers who were good at cartography and constructing forts, but the forts that they constructed were easily, the British could easily capture them or go around them. Mm-hmm. And so the importance of the French is that they were the masters. The School of Engineering in France was developed by Sébastien Lepret de Vauban, who was the sort of the master of, he had developed the treaties of siege warfare and and also fortification in the 17th century, and that lasted right up until the 19th century. So that the Washington realized that he needed French officers to be able to teach them how to use the artillery and how to dig, make siege trenches and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that's important to note is that what the Americans had built Fort Washington and Fort Lee on the Hudson. The Crown forces captured Fort Washington in a matter of 4 hours, and they. Consequently, the occupants of Fort Lee all left in a rush, leaving their food, their tents, and everything. And they just escaped. The ones who were left behind were captured, and they were all probably pretty much drunk at the time, but they were captured. So then that was one of the reasons that they needed the French fortifications. Duportail was involved with developing the fortifications at Yorktown and at West Point, none of which had ever been attacked. The French also supervised the fortifications at West Point. No, did I say West Point earlier? Yes. I meant Valley Forge.
Valley Forge, right.
And the Yorktown fortifications were never attacked. The West Point also was never attacked, and they were fortifications that were done under the supervision of the French, primarily Colonel de la Radière. Kosciuszko was also involved, but whenever Kosciuszko and the French didn't get along, whenever Duportail was going to go to West Point, Kosciuszko made a point of being away.
Wow.
So. And Kosciuszko was a supporter of General Gates. So when Gates went south, he wanted to go south with Gates. And Washington gladly let him go because Gates was involved in the Conway cabal.
Right. We can tell. No, Conway had a French connection, didn't he?
Yes, he did. In fact, he had relatives from France. He was of French descent, I believe, in some sort, in some fashion.
It's interesting because there is, on the one hand, there is, I know when John Jay goes to Paris, I mean, he really doesn't like the French. His family were French Huguenots, and his brother shows up in Paris to tell everyone how much his brother, who's negotiating, really doesn't like the Allies. I know I know your focus has been on the military story here, but I wonder if there is anything more on the diplomatic side of this, as Franklin, Jay, and Adams are off in Paris trying to negotiate, and they have, Vergennes certainly has his own ideas about, the way things should go. It's the more you look at this, the more you realize how complicated it is and how impossible it seems for this alliance to work and for this revolution to work.
Yeah, one of the things that I found interesting was that when excuse me, when Washington wanted to get some generals, he wanted 4 generals. Duportail was the first of the 4 generals who came. They were the only ones who were authorized by the King of France. All the others came on their own accord. So they were the result of negotiations with Franklin and Dean.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the interesting stories I found was that Franklin did not speak French, and Duportail did not speak English. So he had to go through a translator. Usually it was I think it was John Lawrence who did translations for him. And at one time, John Lawrence was not available, and Duportail tried to make heads or tails of a document that Benjamin Franklin had sent him, and he totally misunderstood it, thinking that he was not accepted in the Continental Army. But at one point, Franklin tried to impose on Duportail the necessity of secrecy.
Mm-hmm.
And so in order to maintain that secrecy, they did not meet in the common places that they would expect to be met. If they were meeting at Franklin's place, Franklin would make sure that nobody else was in the area, so that his visitors would not be detected. Well, Duportail offered to Franklin that they could speak Latin, and that would further facilitate the secrecy. Franklin didn't know Latin either,
right?
So
yeah,
they continued to write in French and English.
Wow, yeah, it's a big problem. Go on.
I don't know that any of the other delegates, Jay and Dean, or any of the people negotiating the affairs in France spoke French either. So they probably have to work through translators.
Yeah, it's made it very complicated to go through that. What about the role of the French in the West Indies? I mean, that was a big focus for the French as well as the English, probably more so than the North American colonies. So, is any connections here with the France's West Indian colonies and the Revolution?
Yeah, there were more French soldiers in the West Indies than there were in America, and that's why Saint-Simon's troops were brought up along with de Grasse's fleet, because they were all stationed in the West Indies. The sugar trade was very important, both to the French and the English. So both countries would be fighting back and forth, trying to capture each other's islands.
Yeah,
and there's some of the sugar islands that changed hands several times during the course of the American War. By the same token, the East Indies were also important to both countries because of the spice trade.
Right.
So they were fighting both the spice trade and the sugar trade. And once the war was coming to a head in the South, the troops from the West Indies could be spared for only a short period of time, so to come up to assist in Yorktown, and then toward the latter end of the war, the focus all shifted to India. So you have a lot of the actions going on in India, trying to defeat the East India Company, who had a monopoly on the tea trade.
And the East India Company plays a role, of course, in the beginning of the revolution.
Correct.
Too.
And they actually stayed in existence until around the mid-19th century.
Really? Okay. Wow. So how does it go for the French in the East Indies then, and the French and the English still fighting this war in the East Indies?
They tried to expel the English totally, but they didn't. They ended up each having their own areas of concentration. Much like in the West Indies, you had the French islands and the English islands.
Right.
The same thing in India. You had the main cities were dominated by the English, and also certain sections were dominated by the French.
Interesting. So it really is a global war then. It begins.
It was, yes.
Yeah. So yeah.
We could consider it the First World War.
Yeah. So we've been talking with Norm Desmarais from Providence College, author of America's First Ally, France in the Revolutionary War, and other books on the French and Americans in the War for Independence. And Norm is also an active public historian, a reenactor. He is a member of Le Regiment Bourbonnais, I'm probably mispronouncing that, as well as the 2nd Rhode Island and the Brigade of the American Revolution. How did you get into being a reenactor as well as an historian?
Well, I've always had an interest in the Revolutionary War, and when I was looking for a project to work on my first sabbatical, I decided to research the Revolutionary War. About the time, that was the period when CD-ROM was an important technology, and I had worked with a company as a consultant on developing some of their products on CD-ROM, and they asked me one day if I had all the resources available that I needed, what would I do? And I said, well, first I would do a multimedia CD on the Revolutionary War. And people asked me why the Revolutionary War and not the Civil War, because there was a lot of interest on the Civil War. And I said, that's precisely it. Everybody's doing work on the Civil War. Nobody's done anything on the Revolutionary War for 25 years.
Yeah.
So I said, well, that would be my focus. And now there's a big shift to Revolutionary War because of bicentennial and the coming to the 225th, and now the 250th coming up.
Yeah. Interesting.
So when I was starting to work on that, I needed some background information. I wanted to get some photos and things. So I started going to some reenactments, and I got I got introduced to the commander of the regiment in Rhode Island, and this was in November. I thought by the following spring he would have lost my contact information or forgotten about me, but he didn't. He called me up and asked me if I would want to field with them, and so I did, and that one thing led to another, and I've been doing that ever since.
Good for you. Good for you. Well, it's been great talking to you, Norm. Thank you for joining us. We've been
talking
with. Thank you very
much for having me, Bob.
And Norm Desmarais, and we hope to talk to you again. Great work on France in the Revolutionary War, America's First Ally, and your guides to the Revolutionary War. And so I want to thank you. I want to also thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, and our many listeners. You know, Norm, initially we thought we'd have a handful of folks in and around Boston listening to us, but we really are reaching people all around the world. And last week we've had people downloading in the Czech Republic, in Russia, in Thailand, in the Virgin Islands. And I want to thank listeners in these places. If you're in one of these places I'm going to mention, send an email to Jonathan Lane, jlane@masshist.org. He'll send you one of our Revolution 250 lapel pins. So I want to thank listeners in Lima, Ohio, and in 4 places that have French connections. We have listeners in Paris and in Ravine in the Ardennes. Am I saying that right, Norm?
Yes, you are.
And in Louisville, Colorado, and St. Louis, Missouri. So thank you all for listening. Thank you for joining us. Thanks, Norm. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.
Thanks for having me.